Good evening, boys and ghouls. Welcome back. I am your humble host D, your guide on this tricky trek through the territories of terror. We have now arrived at the 40s. Since the world got somewhat dark and messy around this time, the Western cultural landscape responded by getting more lighthearted, providing escapism rather than challenging their viewers. This list will be heavy on American-made movies because Europe was kinda preoccupied throughout the decade, really. So, without further ado, let's dive in. The Beast with Five Fingers, a movie about a severed hand that goes about killing people. Kinda like Thing from the Addams Family, but with a psychological twist to it. The movie keeps you guessing until the end whether the hand is real or if it's just in their heads. The standout actor in this one is easily Peter Lorre in what might be one of his best performances. If there's any doubt as to why he was a big deal at the time, watch this and you'll see. The Beast with Five Fingers is one of those movies that are generally overlooked, which is something that I say needs a change in. Son of Dracula. Despite the title, the vampire in this movie is in fact Dracula himself, not his progeny. But he protects his identity ever so cleverly by writing his name backwards. Dracula is portrayed here by one of the big names of the 40s, Lon Chaney Jr., son of the Man of 1,000 Faces from the silent era. He's a likable actor, although I'm not too sure what I think of him as Dracula though, but there's enough atmosphere around him that this is not really a problem. Son of Dracula is a bumpy ride. It hasn't aged perfectly, and while some parts hold up well, others just come off as comedic. Still, it deserves the number 9 spot. Return of the Vampire was released the same year as Son of Dracula. This time the vampire isn't Dracula, but is played by Bela Lugosi, so he feels a lot more like Dracula than Chaney did. Return of the Vampire is a bit of a mess, to be honest, with a plot that goes all over and several what the f*** moments. But there's a genuine feel to it, and enough fog to satisfy all your needs. Cause if there's one thing that's clear, the filmmakers sure love them some fog. And there's a werewolf named Andreas. Thought it merited some attention.
You're a fool, Andreas, a complete utter fool.
The Mummy's Hand. In the 40s, Universal started a new Mummy franchise unrelated to the Karloff movie of the previous decade. This time the mummy is named Karis. He stays in bandage at all times and is controlled by a cult of priests that keep him alive using the mystical Tana leaves. The movie has a more humorous style, almost pure slapstick at times, which clashes a bit with the serious moments of the story. It had several sequels and the whole thing got old pretty soon, but this one holds up. The Mummy's Hand is easygoing and enjoyable, and I find myself digging it back up every now and then. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I take it, is a story that most people are somewhat familiar with. Every decade seems to have at least one movie version of this Robert Louis Stevenson classic, and this one from the 40s might be one of the more memorable, mainly because of Spencer Tracy as the main character. He steals the show entirely, almost to the point that you forget the other strengths of the film, such as Ingrid Bergman, who does not easily slip your notice. As I said, there are many takes on this story. I'm not saying this is the definite version by any means, but it is certainly one of the better. The Invisible Man had a sequel in the early 40s with the story of a wrongly convicted man who is given the invisibility serum by a relative of the first Invisible Man in order to escape from prison. In the lead role this time we find one of the biggest names in horror history, Vincent Price, in the early days of his career. Perfect casting, I say. There's so much personality in his voice that you barely notice him being invisible. The movie gives an interesting view into the faltering psyche of a desperate man, lined with great acting and some superb practical effects. It's a great sequel, almost as good as the original. Almost. In the 40s, Universal Studios went for entertainment over quality, which resulted in their so-called Monster Mash movies, where they teamed up their classic monsters. House of Frankenstein is one of the better ones. You get almost everything you hope for. The Frankenstein monster, Dracula, Wolfman, a mad scientist, and a hunchback assistant. No mummy though, and Dracula is kinda wasted. But apart from that, everything is in order. This was Boris Karloff's last role in a Frankenstein movie. However, he doesn't play the monster, but ironically, the scientist. House of Frankenstein is far from perfect, but it does give us good wrap-ups for several of the many story arcs. It would have been a fine finale to the Universal Golden Age. Then they made House of Dracula. That one's not on the list. The Body Snatcher takes place in Edinburgh in the 19th century during the Burke and Hare era of medical research and grave robbery. It was the last movie that the two titans Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi starred in together, although Lugosi only has a quite pointless minor role. Karloff, however, no matter how great he might be in movies like Bride of Frankenstein and The Black Cat, this might just be the best performance of his career, and that is saying something. The Body Snatcher is a bit uneven, but it's very memorable. Honestly, watch it for Karloff. You will not regret it. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. This was the first of the Monster Mash cycle and quite possibly the best. This time around the monster is played by Bela Lugosi and it feels wrong. Not that it does a bad job with it. You know that classic thing with the monster walking with his arms outstretched? That one started here, as the character was originally meant to be blind, something that was glossed over in the final version. There's also a very unexpected musical number here that you guys just have to experience.
One and all and sing a song. Parola, paroline. Parola, paroline. For life is short, but death is long. Parola, paroline. Parola, paroline. There'll be no music in the tomb, so sing with joy and down with gloom. Tonight the new wine is in bloom. Paro, 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 long.
So random, but quite relevant to the story. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman is entertaining through and through, and as I mentioned, it set a trend for its time. As usual, before we get to the top spot, let's fire off some honorable mentions. Cat People is a psychological horror / thriller with great atmosphere and some awesome scenes. It just barely didn't make the final cut. The Invisible Woman, the third installment in the Invisible Man franchise, is also a fine movie. It's not really horror though, more action comedy. Good movie, just not right for this list. Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein has the same problem. It's honestly one of the best Monster Mash movies. Hell, it even has Bela Lugosi reprising his role as Dracula for the one and only time. But it's pure comedy, not horror. Finally, a small part of me kinda wanted to include Disney's Legend of Sleepy Hollow in this list. I mean, it did scare me as a kid, but yeah, that would probably have been a stretch. So, on to the number one spot. Many of you have probably guessed it already. It's gonna be a howl. The Wolfman. It wasn't the first werewolf movie, not even the first from Universal Studios, but it set the standard for its kind. This is the movie that made Lon Chaney Jr. the new horror superstar. He is sympathetic and believable in the role of a man who doesn't know whether he's losing his mind or if he's actually turning into a werewolf. This is not nearly a perfect movie, with among other things several confusing continuity issues, but the atmosphere is on point. Come to think of it, that's pretty much true for all of these 40s movies. Never perfect, always entertaining. The Wolfman is in many ways a straggler from the previous decade, but to me it is, more than any other, the perfect image of the horror landscape of the early 40s.
Go now, and heaven help you.
And that, dear friends, was my choice for the top 10 horror movies of the 40s. Leaving World War II behind, we enter a movie era entirely different from the previous decades, but that is a story for next time. I hope you join me in the 50s as we continue on towards Halloween. Thanks for watching, catch you on the flip side.